The Arctic is changing fast as we see the great powers compete for its natural resources and also to use the region as a very competitive transportation corridor. We see that cooperation in the Arctic was traditionally largely immune to geopolitics because the Arctic was considered to be a frozen desert without many competing strategic interests that would fuel any rivalry. Now, this ensured mutually beneficial cooperation in areas such as sustainable development, environmental protection, scientific discoveries, the protection of indigenous peoples, and other cooperation, which was very much defined as a positive sum game. In short, a lot of this was exempted from the more zero-sum geopolitics. Now, even at the times of great power conflict during the Cold War, cooperation in the Arctic continued often to be exempted from this due to the mutually beneficial cooperation as well as trust building. What we see now, however, is that this era appears to have come to an end for two main reasons. The first, the Arctic increasingly becomes the home of strategic competing interests, then primarily natural resources and that of it being a transportation corridor. The second is that for the past 3 decades, relation between NATO countries and Russia as the Arctic countries continue to deteriorate. So let's address both of these topics separately. Now, what is really the strategic interest in the Arctic? Well, as the Arctic becomes warmer and the ice recedes, the region is revealed to be an incredible treasure cove. Incredible amount of energy resources have become available for extraction. We're not just talking about oil, but gas and minerals, which can really fuel the international economy for decades to come. The Arctic also hosts maritime transportation corridors that are both cheaper and faster than their rivals. So for ships going between Europe and East Asia, going along the Russian Arctic coastline is about 40% shorter than the alternative route going through the Suez Canal. With growing fears of US blockades and cutting off key choke points such as the Malacca Strait, the Arctic route is seen as a way to get around this. It's outside the control of the US Navy. Furthermore, the Arctic route enables other great powers to challenge the US insistence to dominate the world by controlling its main seas. So Russia is now developing its Arctic route by building new ports and accompanying infrastructure, search and rescue infrastructure, also building a military presence in the region. Russia has also developed the largest icebreaker fleet in the world by far, and Russia calls it its Arctic route for the Northern Sea Route. There are subsequently great economic interests in the Arctic that can contribute to further shift the entire geoeconomic balance of power in the world, from the west to the east, which implies that competition and conflict is to be expected and there's a lot at stake. So this takes us to the intensification of geopolitical, if not geoeconomic rivalry. Because after the Cold War, Russia's main foreign policy was to integrate with the West to construct an inclusive European security architecture, what they then refer to as a Greater Europe. Now, this was relevant for the Arctic and its development because the Western countries and their corporations were prioritized for economic cooperation by the Russians and energy extraction. So not only for economic and technological reasons, but also political, given that this would help to develop this Greater Europe the Russians were pursuing. And while Russia has about 50% of the Arctic coastline, the other 7 Arctic states are all Western, and it therefore also made it, simply put, common sense to cooperate in the Arctic. However, the dream of Greater Europe began to go away and fade away once NATO expanded, Yet, the real pivotal moment came in 2014 when the Western states backed a coup in Ukraine to pull the country into the NATO orbit. This became proof for the Russians that Ukraine would become a frontline rather than a bridge. And as a result, the Greater Europe initiative died. Indeed, the past 300 years of Russian Western-centric foreign policy, since Peter the Great, when it looked towards the West for modernization, it also come to an end. And Russia instead embraced what it refers to as the Greater Eurasia Initiative, that is, reorganizing its economy from the West to the East. So immediately after the coup in Ukraine, we saw new initiatives being rushed through, such as the Power of Siberia gas pipeline going from Russia to China. But we also saw other gas projects. We saw new oil physical transportation infrastructure. A lot of this was also financed with new banks, payment systems, the use of national currencies. So when the energy shifts, much of the rest of the international economic system also goes with it. So there's also more shipping that can be done outside the Western insurance systems. Overall, we see now a growing decoupling from the Western-centric economic system, with China becoming Russia's main and indispensable partner. Now, what makes things even more problematic is that NATO expressed its intention to become more involved in the Arctic. We saw with Mike Pompeo in 2019, he gave up a geopolitical speech at the Arctic Council, in which Russia and China were seen as being key challengers there. This was a very unusual thing because the Arctic Council was not usually the format for pursuing or speaking of this kind of militaristic zero-sum interest.
The Arctic is at the forefront of opportunity and abundance. It houses 13% of the world's undiscovered oil, 30% of its undiscovered gas, and an abundance of uranium, rare earth minerals, gold, diamonds, and millions of square miles of untapped resources. Fisheries galore. And its centerpiece, the Arctic Ocean, is rapidly taking on new strategic significance. Steady reductions in sea ice are opening new passageways and new opportunities for trade. This could potentially slash the time it takes to travel between Asia and the West by as much as 20 days. Arctic sea lanes could come the 21st century Suez and Panama canals. China's pattern of aggressive behavior elsewhere should inform what we do and how it might treat the Arctic. We're concerned about Russia's claim over the international waters of the Northern Sea Route, including its newly announced plans to connect it with China's maritime Silk Road. On the security side, partly in response to Russia's destabilizing activities, we are hosting military exercises, strengthening our force presence, rebuilding our icebreaker fleet, expanding Coast Guard funding, and creating a new senior military post for Arctic affairs inside of our own military. NATO's Trident structure exercise last fall was the largest Arctic military exercise since the Cold War, with over 50,000 persons participating.
Then in 2021, we saw the US pushing for military bases and is getting these deals, not just in Norway, but then they also began to push them throughout Scandinavia. And indeed, after 2022, when the Russians invaded Ukraine, we saw that the West suspended cooperation in the Arctic Council. And also, NATO pursued further expansion, that is, Finland and Sweden joined. Suddenly, we saw of all the 8 Arctic countries, we had one which was Russia with about 50% of the coastline. The other 7 are all now NATO countries: the US, Canada, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, with Greenland being what makes Denmark an Arctic state. So NATO, which is a military bloc with the post-Cold War mission of establishing collective hegemony in Europe, now also argue that NATO should be tasked with security in the Arctic, where Russia, again, owns half the coastline. So from Moscow, this sounds like a declaration to dramatically escalate the new Cold War. So what is Russia doing, given that great power rivalry is intensifying and the Western countries doesn't even want to speak with Russia in what used to be a geopolitical Arctic Council? Well, development of the Arctic is increasingly becoming an initiative integrate under this greater Eurasia initiative. The main partner, therefore, in the Arctic is becoming China. And we see China, it refers to itself as a near Arctic state. Now, glancing at a map, China is not near the Arctic, but nonetheless, this does reflect its intentions and also its ability now to become a key player in the Arctic. And given that Russia, as the largest Arctic country, invites China into the Russian Arctic, it is indeed becoming an Arctic state. And the Chinese have a lot of interest both in transportation as well as extracting energy resources, as well as other interests. Now, the Arctic corridor, that is the transportation corridor between Asia and Europe, is referred to as the Northern Sea Route by Russia. And the Chinese have labeled it the Polar Silk Road, thus conceptually integrating it within the framework of the New Silk Road, that is including with the Belt and Road Initiative. So Russia is also inviting other countries in the east, such as India, to participate in the development of the Arctic. So we see the region thus becoming the roof of this Eurasian continent and the Eurasian project, which, should be added, is developed as a way of diversifying away from the hegemonic system, the hegemonic economic system developed by the United States after the Second World War. So it's within this framework we now see the United States pushing back to increase its role in the Arctic. Trump, as we've seen, has now called for annexing Greenland. Indeed, he also expressed interest in Greenland in his first administration, but this time around, Trump does not rule out military force to take it from Denmark, which would also end Denmark's status as an Arctic power. Because Greenland is rich in minerals and it's a vast continent, and it's also important to gain access to the Arctic and the maritime corridors. So the Europeans now, they're not really in a position to resist the pressure coming from the United States to take over its energy and transportation corridors. Their only card to play appears to be to give the Americans whatever they want, in the hope that the display of loyalty and submissiveness will show that they are an important partner and the US will not deprioritize Europe. We saw that Biden could destroy the European energy infrastructure to cut the Europeans off from the Russian gas suppliers, and the European response was merely to rush to provide political cover for the American attack on their own energy infrastructure. Similarly, we can see Trump sit in front of a European leader, that is here the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, and argue that Greenland is important for America and they will take the territory, and with no reaction at all from his European counterpart.
Greenland. What is your vision for the potential annexation of Greenland and getting them potentially to...
Well, I think it'll happen, and I'm just thinking, I didn't give it much thought before, but I'm sitting with a man that could be very instrumental. You know, Mark, we need that for international security, not just security, international. We have a lot of our favorite players, cruising around the coast, and we have to be careful. And we'll be talking to you. It's a very appropriate, really a very appropriate question.
It's an issue in the high north, so the Arctic. So what you did, so when it comes to Greenland, yes or not joining the US, I would leave that outside for me this discussion because I don't want to drag NATO in that. But when it comes to the high north and the Arctic, you are totally right. The Chinese are now using these routes. We know that the Russians are rearming. We know we have a lack of icebreakers. So the fact that the outside Russia, there are 7 Arctic countries working together on this under US leadership is very important to make sure that that region, that part of the world stays safe. And we know things are changing there and we have to be there.
As Scandinavia is militarized with tens of US military bases, these countries are effectively outsourcing their foreign policy and embracing future vassal status. The Arctic is therefore quickly becoming a key region for the great power to compete over the future resources. The main powers are therefore Russia, China, and the US, while the Europeans have to a large extent ceded any role and made themselves completely irrelevant as the multipolar world order asserts itself.